Despite Reverse 1999's notoriety as a wholesome and feel-good story where nothing ever goes wrong and everyone typically receives the ending that they deserve, there are the rare cases where a character may undergo generally unpleasant or even traumatizing experiences. And in the cases where this happens, it is typically intended to be a sort of stumbling point for that character. The bulk of their role in the story will typically be devoted to addressing and navigating this obstacle either directly or through some sort of narrative allegory, helping them come to terms with this new reality that has been thrust upon them to varying degrees of success. And that makes sense. Conflict drives narrative. However, there are some cases where this conflict is resolved long before the primary story. The character in question has had their trial, struggled against it, and eventually overcome it. They have already faced this symbol for the shadow within themselves and reconciled it with their own conscious ego. Carl Gustav Jung, who I have spoken about in a previous video, had a specific term for this process, which he referred to as the process of individuation, the process through which someone attains wholeness of being, becoming the self as they truly are, without the conceit of a persona or the repression of their less desirable aspects, their shadow. It is this constant process of introspection and acceptance, something Jung considered to potentially be a lifelong work. And in most cases, that is exactly what it is for people, the constant striving for self-improvement. In some cases, however, one who has progressed along the path of individuation may then elect to aid others in their own journeys, and this is what we are going to be focusing on today. It is something that Jung referred to as the wounded physician, or more colloquially, the wounded healer. Now, wounded can invoke many different images, particularly when it comes to narratives where themes are typically subject to metaphor or allegory. It can present as a literal physical wound, like Shaman's missing arm, mental anguish, such as Six's crisis prior to the revelation, or even emotional blocks, like Tuesday's very literal contest against fear itself. And not so coincidentally, these are going to be the three characters that we're going to be focusing on for this video. And it's also important to note that neither individuation nor being a wounded healer necessarily implies a perfect individual. They're not exempt from making mistakes or experiencing hardship, they're just a little bit wiser about it. To Jung, treatment did not arise from the immaculate or the perfect. Someone without fault was not qualified to become a physician. Rather, healing came from those who had suffered. One must be wounded in order to become a healer, and by experiencing tribulations, the physician then obtains the knowledge necessary to help others. However, if we're going to be talking about perfection, it's best then to start with the purported paragon of perfection himself, Six, or Atticus as he used to be known. Now, the crux of Atticus's conflict is that of the revelation. His entire childhood he has known of the revelation, this phenomena which descends upon all sixes upon their ascension to the title of leader of a Peyron, and while he understands conceptually what this means, the revelation grants all the knowledge held by previous six predecessors, he never truly grasps the implications of what this may entail. It's only when he sees it firsthand that the gravity of it becomes apparent to him. On the night that his mother had passed, the revelation descended upon Alma, his aunt and stand-in caretaker, and in this moment he recognizes a shift. The Alma that he had once known was no longer the Alma that stood before him. It was as if she had become an entirely different person. In his mind, the revelation had irrevocably changed her, and being of the same bloodline would eventually irrevocably change him. And this is his struggle, a struggle against an inevitable and unbeatable fate. Ultimately, it's not a question of whether he can avoid it, but whether he should even try, whether he ought to just allow it to happen, to surrender to an unbeatable foe. And in the end, he chooses to rebuke it. Despite knowing the futility of all, despite knowing how pointless it's going to be, he opts to resist. He sequesters himself away and imbibes all manner of knowledge in the hopes of filling his vessel and lessening the blow of a transcendental wisdom from bearing down upon him. And eventually he does find his answer, and it's the same answer that he comes to regarding the future of a Peyron, and the same answer he gives 37 when she is at her crossroads. And it is why, when Marta comes to him seeking guidance in the face of the storm, he can offer no words of advice, only that she must make the choice for herself. One can only hope to set right in others what they're able to set right in themselves. Marta's conflict, one of choice, is something that Six has rarely ever had to contend with in any significant fashion. His burden had always been the inexorable, a fate that had already been decided, the future laid out before him like a map. Where Marta's doubts stem from an uncertainty of her own fate, Six never really had that luxury to begin with, and so he can offer no guidance. On the contrary, 37's plight is one he is able to resonate with, because while she too faces uncertainty, it is a brand of uncertainty that Six is well acquainted with, that of how to address fate. By the time 37 faces her crossroads, fate is already determined. The storm is coming and she descends into the cave seeking truth, and Six, knowing what she is bound to find at the end of that path, guides her along it regardless. Like Atticus once did, 37 grapples with the reality of a truth she cannot accept, that there is no truth, that everything she believed in, everything that she had known about the world, was founded on a lie. And it is here that Six offers her the conclusion that he had come to all those years ago. Either be wise, uninvolved, and look on, or be practical, involved, and suffer. Burdened with the weight of an absolute, inescapable fate, Six chooses to be an observer, to become detached, both to spare himself and to spare those around him the pain of separation. And he makes this choice twice, first when he anticipates the descent of the revelation, and again when he learns of the island's end. Presented with the same choice, 37 picks a different option. The physician guides the patient to the path, and there their courses diverge. Where Six chooses to abstain from worldly attachments, to remain strictly this denizen of the transcendental, 37 instead chooses to dive headlong into the phenomenal world, to become entrenched in the mire and messiness of reality, to open herself up to mundane suffering, and in doing so become a wholly individuated person herself. And so, in the pursuit of completion, the two part ways. Now, if 6 and 37's conflict is to grapple with fate and destiny, this pragmatic conflict of reason, then Shaman and Kaalaa's conflict is one of empathy, of shared experience. Now, Shaman's an interesting one because Jung's idea of the wounded physician shares many close parallels with traditional shamanic practice. Specifically, this idea that experiencing suffering was a catalyst that granted one the ability to cure others. Initiation into shamanism is typically precipitated by a wounding of sorts, and this can be a literal physical wound or deformity, or it could be mental, this mar on the psyche. Some things that we would today classify as dysfunction, some forms of neurodivergence, for example, would in some traditions have been interpreted as communing with the spirits or some manner of divine favor. And in these cases, it wasn't something to be shunned or feared, but rather revered. In some traditions, this wounding would have been purposely inflicted upon the shaman to be as part of an initiation rite, while in other cases the wounding is incidental, and it's upon sustaining this wound that the person is then inducted onto the shamanic path. Now, while Shaman's obvious wound is the missing arm, the crux of his character arc is internal. It is his self-doubt, his misgivings about his place in the world, the sense that he doesn't truly belong anywhere. In his childhood, Shaman had been known as Pusha, the son of a renowned arcanist family. However, holding this title while also considering himself to be a friend of humans presented to him an inherent contradiction. His duty as the progeny of the illustrious Sharmas versus his own convictions that humans were inherently good. And in the end, this contradiction could only resolve in violent fashion. The humans that he had trusted so surely torched his home, leaving his mother and father to perish in the flames, with the blame for this tragedy laid squarely upon his shoulders. Filled with regret and a desire for vengeance, deprived of his family and his friends, Pusha then has no choice but to flee. And this internal struggle, this idea of being in conflict with the world, is reflected in his exodus. Cast out into the wilderness, Pusha finds himself in opposition with the forces of nature. The river that he must cross, the beast that he must contend with, the brambles and the boulders that bar his way, he sees them all as obstacles. They are things to be overcome, to be defeated. And in trying to do so, Pusha finds himself more and more worse for the wear, until eventually, beaten and battered, he collapses. And if it hadn't been for the old shaman that he would eventually succeed, he would have frozen to death then and there. The answer that Pusha finally finds is that nature is not something to be rebuked, that instead of antagonizing the natural order, forcing himself to be something he is not. He ought to instead embrace his own nature. His entire life, he has struggled between the self and the persona imposed upon him by birthright, and in struggling, he has accrued wounds that cannot be rectified. The damage has been done, and though he has healed, the scar will always remain, just like his missing arm. But he has grown past it. All the grievances and regrets of the past he has accepted, processed, and then let go, recognizing them as a natural consequence of existence. He is scarred, yes, but in growing the self, the size of those scars have lessened. He is reconciled. But Kumar isn't. His sister and Kaalaa's mentor acts as this sort of dark mirror to their struggle. Like them, Kumar faces alienation from her family, from Arcana society, and from her academic peers. However, unlike them, she is unable to find peace. She remains anchored to who she believes she should be. She refuses to change, stubbornly obsessing over what should have been hers. She has been rejected by everything and everyone, and in turn she rejects everything and everyone, putting forth her own desires as paramount to all else. She fixates so extremely on retaining what she believes is rightfully hers that when even that rejects her, she is left bereft of purpose and subsequently ends her own life. And it is in Kumar's death that Kaalaa affirms her own existence. It is only when this overlaying shadow is finally dispelled that she is able to grow past her own feelings of inferiority. Unlike Shaman, the pressure to conform with Kaalaa is not external but internal. It is the image of Kumar that she has built up in her own head, her unbeatable mentor. She places herself in a deferential position, accepting almost subconsciously that Kumar will always be a step ahead, that she cannot be surpassed. It's only after yet another defeat at Kumar's hands at the most crucial point of the story that she is finally able to break down her preconceived notions, thanks in no small part to Shaman. Shaman, who is well acquainted with these feelings of regret and rejection. He spurs her on to continue and face Kumar for one final time, and it's here that, like Shaman once did, Kaalaa finally sees the truth of her crisis for what it really is. Shaman had seen his path in life as one of conflict and contradiction, only to recognize later that this was his own narrow view of the world, a wall that he had built for himself, its foundations crafted from others' denigrations and his own regret and expectations. The wall that Kaalaa built, her own repressions, stem from this overinflated perception that she has of Kumar, which is dispelled upon coming face to face with the real deal. The domineering woman she had once aspired to was nothing more than a shadow of her former self. Alone, disheveled, and hidden away underground, her mind twisted with obsession, every aspect of Kumar that Kaalaa had once touted as unbeatable was now in disarray. She was nothing like the image that she had built up. In the end, although Kaalaa was not the one who pulled the trigger, she was the one who took away the last thing Kumar was living for. She is the conquering hero. She has slain her own monster, and in doing so inherits the position that Kumar had occupied for so long in her head. And now we get to the most contentious member of this list, Tuesday. Because as twisted as Tuesday's perceptions are, as ethically questionable her methods, if you look beyond all that, it becomes pretty clear that her journey and her role in the story follow the path of the wounded physician. Tuesday does not interact with fear the way most people would. Even being presented with visions of her own death, she barely flinches. At a glance, one could go as far as to say that she is fearless. But this is not the case. Tuesday experiences fear, she says as much herself, and she explains it through two distinct metaphors. Fear as the doubt of oneself, and fear as the loss of control, both things that she is intimately familiar with. Prior to the story, Tuesday's family and fiancé are killed in a random attack, right? What should have been a happy future was taken from her in this senseless act of violence, tearing away any semblance of control in her life. At the same time, she is stripped of her identity. She becomes a drifter, and upon coming across the motel, forfeits even that. The name that she signs on the entry forms is not her given name, Christine, but an alias, Tuesday. The assuredness of who she is gone, burned away alongside her previous life. Who is Christine? What place does she have left in a world devoid of family or home? Christine is no one. The name died on the same day that her family died. Yet at a glance it's easy to think these deaths had little impact. The way she comports herself signals an almost blasé attitudes towards tragedy, but I don't think this is truly the case. The motel is a confessional of sorts, a place to reconcile your deepest doubts and insecurities, and for Tuesday, this manifests both as the taking of her name as well as a literal flight from fear, an embodiment of the loss of control. Soon after entering the motel, Tuesday is subjected to its horrors, finding herself being chased by a creature through its halls and being shown gruesome visions of her own death. And it is in these moments of great duress that her thoughts invariably shift to those of her departed family. She recounts frequently the circumstances of their deaths, and at one point even laments the fact that she hadn't died alongside them. Beyond just trying to scare her, the motel is forcing her to process this loss, something that I think she has been repressing in her wanderings up to this point. The things that she had repressed are eventually expressed in an undesirable way, namely that of the motel. And similarly, this same expression occurs in the form that the motel eventually takes. An infant swaddled in cloth, this symbol of the maternal care for a child. She longs for motherhood, a possibility that was taken from her on the day she lost her fiancé, and it's something that she often projects, not just on the motel, but on all of the other children she comes across. Though she may not consciously show it, how Tuesday chooses to interface with the world and others reflects the indelible stain that her losses have left upon her. Now, the motel is a confessional, yes. The thing is, it is not just Tuesday's confessional alone. Anyone who stays is given this trial, this opportunity to take control and master their own fear, to face the things that they had been repressing or avoiding. The ones who couldn't were doomed to this cyclical loop of repeating their own failures over and over again. Sigmund Freud described a tendency he called repetition compulsion, in which a person unconsciously reenacts traumatic events or their circumstances, with the problem growing increasingly more complex with each iteration. For example, if my own belligerence towards, say, my parents was the source of a great deal of grief for me in my childhood, it may then manifest in my adulthood as a disdain for my boss or for other authority figures, thus exacerbating my own neuroses. And Freud believed that this unconscious repetition was, at least in part, an attempt to reconcile with the wounding factor, that in repeating the behavior that had caused one harm, they may then find a new, more functional relationship with it, sort of an attempt to master this grievous emotion. And this urge, this repetition compulsion, is embodied literally by the tenants of the motel. Stefan, the Xeno defector, succumbed to his fear and it fell into a spiral of paranoia until it eventually caused him to take his own life. Argus couldn't accept her insecurities. When faced with them, she stumbled and fell and was only spared due to Verton's interference, and because of this she remains blinded to her own nature. She fails to accept that the reason for her endless chase is her own pride. Her unwillingness to admit that she isn't the invincible Argus that everyone else sees fuels her own self-destruction. She fears failure, and because she is unable to master that fear, she is led by it, devoid of control, forever chasing a goal that she will never find. But Verton managed it. Rather than deny or succumb or flee, she instead faces the manifestation of one of her greatest mistakes and moves past it, and she becomes a stronger person for it. Rather than stop her, it instead galvanizes her resolve, giving her that push to fully break free of the nightmare. The path to healing that had begun by analyzing and acknowledging her baggage in artificial somnambulism comes full circle here. Like Six and like Shaman, Tuesday's role is that of a guide, just not in the typical sense. Where Six guides through rationale and Shaman through empathy, Tuesday is a trial by fire, a mother bird pushing fledglings from the nest, and whether they take to the skies or crash to the earth is purely a matter of their own power. And that is why I make the distinction, and why Jung made the distinction of physician as opposed to healer. Jung did not believe himself to be a healer. The term healer to him implied something impersonal, a conference of wellness, as if a god granting a cure to a lesser being. In contrast, Jung believed that the healing process was a deeply personal affair, a colloquy between two people, one who had surpassed their own wounds and one who sought guidance in that very same journey. A physician will attempt to diagnose, to shed light on what ails a person. They lend what aid they can, but in the end, the onus of actually healing is squarely within the patient's purview. You can show them the path, but they have to be the one to walk it. And while Tuesday may not be a healer in the expected sense, the processes share a parallel. She shows them a means to overcome their own ailments, but actually acknowledging the roots of those ailments is something her guests have to accomplish themselves. And in the end, it's something Tuesday had to accomplish herself. Fleeing from fear, she finally recognizes that the only solution is to face it head on. She stops and for a moment is engulfed in a nightmare, seemingly overtaken by the motel's manipulations. Fear is the doubt of oneself. Fear is the loss of control. And so Tuesday comes to her answer. To regain control, one must become fear. Frightening others is to defy your own fear. In the next moment, she breaks free. The illusion is shattered, the motel subjugated. She has reclaimed herself, and it's in that moment that she truly inherits both the role of motel maid and her new name, Tuesday. 6, Shaman, and Tuesday. Not their given names, but who they are nonetheless. The adoption of a sobriquet is not unique among our arcanists. However, for these three, it is something more personal, more intrinsic to their existence. These are names of rebirth, the names that they adopted after facing their greatest crises. Atticus undergoes great mental turmoil, doing everything he can to avert the revelation, only for it to descend and for him to ascend as the new 6. Pusha shoulders the burden of familial expectation, and it's only upon reconciling with himself and the world that he is given the title of Shaman when he becomes Shaman. Christine, left adrift after her family's murder, adopts her new name at the motel, but it is only upon facing her fears that this mantle is truly passed on. Christine is dead, Tuesday lives. The adoption of a new name is a reconstitution of a person into something stronger, something truer, something more whole, a transition from the old to the new, which is mirrored not just by the name, but by the fact that their new roles are literally being conferred to them from a predecessor. Their traumas may have destroyed them, but through their own efforts they have been remade. And that leads me to my last point. I think it is important to note that while suffering may be a prerequisite to healing, it is not the only prerequisite. If it was, pretty much our entire cast would have some qualifications for being a healer. It's the fact that after facing such adversity, they found a way to become whole again. The wounded healer is not just a sick man, but a sick man who has cured himself, and that recovery is what separates the Vertin from the Mesmer. They are two sides of a coin, two deviating paths of suffering. Jung claimed that neurosis is the avoidance of legitimate suffering, neurosis as the syndrome of repression and denial of this conflict between how one sees themselves versus who they truly are, the shadow versus the persona. And Mesmer falls squarely into this neurotic mold. Rather than try to surpass her pain, she instead chooses to avoid it, to placate it in the hopes that she doesn't find further retribution and, by extension, further suffering. She locks herself into this cyclical loop of self-loathing in order to appease her tormentor, which is to say, her own ingrained, indoctrinated mentality. She adopts the mindset of arcanists are all mad people, but in doing so she rejects herself. She rejects the very core of who and what she is. Simply existing is anathema to her every belief. The only option left, then, is that she must hate herself, because anything else would be contradictory and hypocritical. In a sense, she is trading the more productive pain of growth for the stagnant pain of self-comfort. On the other hand, Burton, who has suffered tremendously time and time again, is constantly seeking to grow past her own pain. The wounds may never fully heal, but in growing the self, the significance of that scar is mitigated, and it's for this reason that she is capable of showing such immense compassion. Rarely ever does she fully dismiss someone as unsalvageable. There is always something worth saving. She is always reaching out that hand to try and find the middle ground, because to a degree she can understand them. She can understand the isolation. She can understand the sense of being misunderstood, of having lost everything, of being a pawn in a cold and uncaring world. Because she has suffered these exact things, she is then able to find them in others. And while she may not be the fully individuated healer in the same sense that 6, Shaman, and Tuesday are, she is still a traveler on that same path. Her story just hasn't ended yet. But this one has. Not gonna lie, this one took a long time. I started writing the script for this right after the Isolde video, and that was, 2 months ago? I just kind of kept getting stuck on it and went to work on other stuff. There were a couple other subjects that I thought could fit under this archetype, specifically Tooth Fairy to Blondie, A Night to Ulrafog, and more recently Mr. Duncan to Sotheby. But in the end, I didn't really think there was enough there to put anything really coherent together, so I just stuck with the 3. Plus 3 is just a really nice round number, right? I admire this archetype. It's one thing to suffer. Everyone experiences suffering at various points in their lives, but to be able to take that suffering, right, to take what could be the most painful, bitter, exhausting aspect of your life and turn it into something productive, right, to turn it into this balm for someone else's wounds is, I think, an incredible feat. I admire it greatly, and that's also part of why I really like these characters. They embody this concept, even if in some cases it may not be in the most conventional sense. But that will be it for now. Thank you to Day and Mikuyan for supporting me on Patreon. I do truly appreciate it. And to the rest of you, thank you for showing up for yet another long-winded video about our silly little game. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next one, okay? Bye-bye.